there's so much harm when people think that racial justice and social justice have nothing to do with environmentalism. It's leading to horrible, horrible outcomes.
This is Climate Curious, the podcast for people who are bored, scared, or confused by climate change.
I'm Maryam, Pasha, the director and curator at TEDxLondon and the co-host of this podcast, alongside the amazing Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Hurst, activist and advocate exploring what positive masculinities can look like, and self-confessed climate normie.
We are back at TED Countdown London. It is amazing to be here. We have been learning lots, hearing some incredible ideas. We're just going to get right into it because I want to use as much time as possible to talk to this guest.
All right.
Is that right?
Yeah, I'm here for
just don't really want to chat with you.
Why has it become so dark so quick? That's fine. We can go into the
Right. We're joined today by the amazing Leah Thomas. She's the co-founder of Intersectional Environmentalist. I just want you to tell us right away, what does that mean?
Intersectional Environmentalist?
Yes.
Well, it's kind of lengthy, so sorry. But intersectional theory was created by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 and is all about overlapping identities and things like that. At first, it was applied to feminism because it was really important to look at the ways Blackness and womanhood intersected. Fast forward to now, I think we should do the same thing with environmentalism and consider the ways identity, things like race and class, impact someone's experience with the natural world around them.
And so you created this platform. I mean, that first of all, that's like the most succinct definition of intersectional environmentalist
Seriously?
I've ever heard in my life. So like 10 points. Not that we give points.
You said it was lengthy. It wasn't even. No, we do give points. And you got 10 of them.
Thank you.
I'm just really curious to know how. So tell us a little bit about you, if you can. Like, that is coming at it from that perspective. I think Ben and I are quite new to this conversation, it feels like a lot of people are having more intersectional conversations now, but it didn't used to be this way. And so I'm really curious to know how you came to viewing kind of environment and climate in this way, and what brought you to this to begin with. What brought you to creating this platform?
Yeah, so I guess I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, so the middle of the United States, and I grew up in a city about 15 minutes away from Ferguson, Missouri, which for some people they may know, if they're familiar, was kind of the starting place of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States because of a police officer involved shooting of Michael Brown, which really sparked the hashtag Black Lives Matter hashtag. And when that happened, I was actually it was about 2 weeks before I started my second semester at uni, and I decided to study environmental science and policy. So I had 2 weeks of living through social unrest and protests in my neighborhood, went off to college, was the only Black student in my new environmental science program.
Wow.
And I was learning about the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and all of these important pieces of legislation that were supposed to protect our right to life and our right to breath. So I couldn't really separate what was going on back home. And whenever I just heard the terminology, I can't breathe, echoed throughout the Black Lives Matter movement, I always just kind of connected it back to environmentalism. So because those things are kind of enmeshed for me, I think I just decided, you know what, I don't want to take part in any type of environmentalism that does not advocate for the right for Black and brown folks to have life. So I just started studying it in every way that I could, and that took me everywhere from being a National Park Service ranger to working at companies like Patagonia to also just writing and blogging and things like that, and then eventually starting my own org and writing a book.
That's a good backstory. That is a good backstory, isn't it?
It is.
I feel like it is.
And I feel like it's a whole other podcast where we say, I just did these things and now I'm running this incredible platform and I'm writing a book. But I really want to dig into the response that you've gotten for this kind of platform. Is this way of thinking resonating with people? Is this something that was missing?
It is now, but to be completely honest, the riots and the uprisings in Ferguson took place in like 2015, I believe. So that's when I kind of started talking about this. And then also for context, environmental justice as a field of study has existed since the 70s or the 80s. And it was inspired by both the U.S. Civil Rights Movement and the Earth Day movement at the time, kind of combining those two ideas. So environmental justice, which looks into racial inequality inequality, classism, and environmental hazards and outcomes has existed for a long time, but hasn't been met positively, I would say. A lot of people, whether it's due to naivete or just blatant racism, often would say environmentalism exists way over here and civil rights and social justice exists over here. But that's not the case, as many lower income folks and Black and brown people around the world can see very clearly because they don't have clean air or water. So I think navigating academia as oftentimes the only Black woman, so both of those dual identities in, science, I was often met with, whether it was subtle gaslighting or just being very dismissive. Even some corporations I worked at, I would try to say, we really need to prioritize environmental justice. And in essence, it would always come down to maybe later. And that's something that you can see throughout all sorts of movements throughout history, where Black and brown folks are told that our liberation can maybe come later. You've seen that in the feminist movement, which is why we have intersectional feminism now, when back in the day, many white women said, race, that's a little too tricky, or LGBTQ plus liberation, that's a little too tricky. Maybe if white women are liberated, we can come back and circle back to Black and brown women. But the fact of the matter is they don't circle back to us. Yeah. So we've had to create our own movements and things like that. So I haven't always been met with positive reception, but in 2020, and again, that was 5 years later, people started coming around. And I think, honestly, it was because of public pressure. The Black Lives Matter movement was trending in a really major way. And all of a sudden, a lot of environmental organizations were like, we need to say something. We have to say something. And it does make me a little sad that they started speaking up because they felt like they had to, because they could have been speaking up since the 80s.
So we keep talking about this platform that you've got. And I find this really interesting because I feel like you say it changed in 2020, right? And off the back of Black Lives Matter, global unrest in terms of like racism and what was happening. My perspective or my perception of what is happening is that it hasn't changed that much. I'm feel like I might be a little bit wrong here, but I'm interested in like what it is that you have made or what it is that you've created and how it works, because I feel like this is a conversation that people still really don't want to have, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the dynamics are definitely very different in the UK and the US, in particular because the UK has climate activism that I've never seen. Like even Europe in general, just the momentum, the magnitude, it's not something that exists in the same way in the United States. So what you're saying is absolutely true. And I think two truths can exist at the same time. What I have seen change is especially Gen Z and millennials saying, okay, I get it. And it makes sense because they're growing up in a world where we're talking about pronouns, we're talking about, identity and things like that. So intersectional environmentalism, duh, it totally makes sense because they're like, what are you talking about? Because if you talk to Gen Zers and you're like, oh, you're a feminist, that's super cool. Let's talk about how the patriarchy and the destruction of the earth is connected. It just almost lights a fire in them. Or even if you're talking about, oh, okay, you're a religious person. Oh, let's look into these religious texts and look at all these themes about protecting the earth. A lot of younger folks want to connect their identity back to the environment. And what I have seen change is specifically within educational systems where they're starting to teach about diverse environmentalists within their environmental programs. And I think even subtle things like that are shifting the ways people think about environmentalism. So they're not just thinking about conservation, and it's almost becoming second nature that, oh yeah, duh, we should talk about air pollution and who's impacted the most. But yeah, after 2020, I am really curious beyond those statements that a lot of organizations have made, what they're doing to actually change things. And I think there's a long way to go.
So what's the deal? Are you like is influencer the right word?
I'm okay with that. Yeah, I would say I'm a blogger, I'm a writer, I'm an influencer. I think that's something that at first I was kind of afraid of, and I think a lot of women are afraid of that title. It's something that's weaponized against us in some ways, in ways that it's not weaponized against men. Men can talk about tech or things that are considered quote unquote manly, and no one calls them influencers, even though they are. But I would say, yeah, I might have a bit of influence online to talk about sustainability and environmental justice. And because of that, it's allowed me to start a nonprofit organization and also, write and do things like that.
This is important, right? Because I guess the big conversation that we all have to be having is how do we get other people into the conversation? Which is like, I feel like comms is like maybe the biggest weapon we've got. Like comms and art hand in hand are like the biggest weapons we've got. Or a satellite, maybe. I don't know if there's some kind of satellite that could just fix the problem. Also that. But I'm interested in
some people believe that is true, but I don't know if that's true.
That's causing the problem. That's another conspiracy theory for another day. But I'm interested in how you are using, or what's the impact of like how you're using those platforms? Do you feel like it's doing what it is that you want it to be doing?
Absolutely. And I think as someone who navigated academia, am a scientist, studied environmental science and policy, I'm very familiar with that. I started realizing that the scientific community, many of us are very elitist, and that's just academia in general. And even in social justice speak, and sometimes I joke around, intersectional environmentalism is 12 syllables. So the thing is, like,
yeah.
It's like, it's really long. But you can say, and I always tell this to science people and sometimes annoying social justice people, you can say the same thing sometimes in 50 different ways. And if the goal is to get as many people as possible to care about our home planet, to care about social justice, let's experiment with the different ways that we can say it. And it's not even that we're dumbing it down, but just making it so people go, okay, yeah, that totally makes sense. So I love communications and I love writing, and I also love digital media because I want to meet people where they're at. And coming from academia, there's so many elitist people who are like, social media is so stupid. It's like there's billions of people who are using this. The truth of the matter is, I want, even if someone is working a 60-hour work week, if they happen to have a moment on the bus that they're on Instagram and they're scrolling and they can swipe through a carousel post and learn about exactly what environmental hazards are happening in their neighborhood, or see an organization that they can support and it only takes them 2 minutes, I want them to also have access to environmental education. It shouldn't be something that's just kept in academia. So it's like, how can we communicate with as many people as possible? Because one message won't work with everybody. So it's kind of like an equation that I love geeking out about all the time.
Finding the right message for the right person is like 100% of the game, right? Like I feel like that is so relevant, and like a really important skill, and not a skill that everyone possesses, which is why it's important that for people who do possess it, that's what they're using it to do, right?
I feel like you've been in all of these different worlds. The academic world, you said you worked in Patagonia for a while, in the business world, in the kind of influencing online space. So I just want to move us into the business world a bit and talk about how you imagine this intersectional view coming to life with the way that businesses are now engaging with climate. And we know that, I think that business can genuinely engage with climate, but I don't think it always does. Right? I think we can pretty much agree on that. So I'm just curious, like, from your vantage point, what do you see as effective and thoughtful engagement?
I would say probably 2 things. One, supply chain. So really getting into that and making sure it's ethical and sustainable, which a lot of people are familiar with. But 2 is wealth redistribution. I honestly think that is the best thing any corporation can do, is give away, even if it's 1% of their funding, to grassroots climate justice organizations. It makes such a big difference. Unfortunately, environmental justice type of work, especially especially that's led by people of color, receives less than 2% of all environmental funding, and that needs to change. And that's something that corporations could actually do pretty quickly, because there's not as much, red tape. Because when we're talking about government, sometimes grant processes might take a really long time, or organizations have to compete for grants. But corporations could cut a check right now. There's a little bit less red tape. There's some. So I think the most important thing any company can do is to fund grassroots climate activism in any ways that they can. I think Patagonia has a great model of this, because they do, just baked into their philosophy, give away a lot of funding to climate justice orgs. Or people can become 1% for the Planet partners, and 1% will take care of that and give 1% of all of their funding to environmental organizations.
You've just had a book published in August of this year called The Intersectional Environmentalist: How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and Planet. Congratulations, first off.
How do we do that? No, Congratulations.
Congratulations, first off. How has that process been, and who are you hoping to reach with this book?
Yeah, it's wild. I started writing the book when I was 25 and I was unemployed, and it was during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. And that's a whole nother conversation for another day, but there are a lot of projects that were suddenly greenlit because of 2020. And it feels strange at times now that I'm reflecting on it. 2 or so years later, at 27, almost 28, like that was kind of a traumatic process to write a book really quickly, to try to get people to care about Black and brown lives. But it was also a really beautiful process at the same time. And I think that's specifically because there's so many contributors in the book, because I knew that I'm not just like, I might say intersectional environmentalism a lot, it's a long term, but there's so many people that embody that in different ways, in ways that I can't explain. Whether it's a friend of mine that talks about queer ecology, it's like such a cool field of study, or disability justice, or ecofeminism, etc. So I feel like the best part of the book was just showing people the range of what intersectional environmentalism can be. And then I think my favorite part wasn't the trauma, because there was a lot of trauma of having to explain, this is environmental injustice, here's all the data, because there's so many times where maybe people didn't believe me or other people of color. So citations are on deck. But
said footnotes. The book is basically one big footnote. Yeah,
it basically is. But I think the most beautiful part was actually just like the fun stories, like, oh, this is a really cool indigenous environmentalist from back in the day, or like, hey, this guy made peanut butter and it was like really cool. And like, I feel like that keeps
I'm
me
sold.
going.
I'll get in the book.
Yeah.
I want to know about the inventor of peanut butter. Yeah. I had no idea that was linked to environmental.
George Washington Carver.
You asked 2 questions. 1, how was it? How was the process? And 2, who do you hope it will reach? Where has the book gone, and where do you want the book to go?
I think the best part of it, and it was something that I really grappled with when I was writing it, but I really did write it kind of for my younger self. Like, I want young Black girls to have a book that validates them as early as possible and says, you belong here, and here are all the reasons why. And it was something I struggled with, because I want everyone to feel represented in the book. And I tried to bring in as many collaborators as possible. But then I realized, you know what? It's okay as a Black woman for me to write books for future Black women. Right. So, and it might not read like that, but there's certain moments that I think when Black people read it, they're like, okay, power to the people. Like, they get it. It's like a little nod. But I think, I want it to be an introductory textbook for a lot of people so they can start their environmental journey and just know, like, I want this book to prevent future harm, because there's so much harm when people think that racial justice and social justice have nothing to do with environmentalism. It's leading to horrible, horrible outcomes that you all are probably so familiar with. But people of color, folks in the global South, low-income people bearing the brunt of the climate crisis. So this book, while it is educational, my goal is to prevent further harm by teaching people as early as possible in their environmental education, whether that's through academia or outside of it, to just click that, okay, social justice, environmentalism are linked. And if that's the one thing people walk away with, then that makes me happy.
I think that's beautiful. And you mentioned the idea of belonging. I think belonging is such a powerful motivator, the search for belonging. I've had a number of conversations recently where people are just starting whole things, doing whole things that take up their whole lives because they have realized that they did not belong for so long, and now they want to create opportunities for others. And I think it's absolutely amazing, because I think that that's very much, and Ben, we've talked about this before, you know, my experience as well was not feeling like the climate space was somewhere where I could belong.
Yeah.
You know, whether for a number of reasons, whether it's because I loved and worked in human rights, whether it's because I'm a fat brown woman, whether it's because I grew up in cities, whatever it might be. And I do think actually it makes such a big difference to think about creating resources so that young people don't have those feelings, so they can choose whether that's somewhere where they want to belong or not.
Yeah, and it reminds me of this story, like, I grew up in a world where my mother went out of her way. I just thought that there were so many Black people in STEM, and there are. But it was because my mom gave me Black dolls.
Right.
I had Black doctor dolls, Black astronaut dolls.
Right.
It wasn't until I was older that I realized, oh my gosh, she had to go out of her way.
I was really trying to. She was making these.
These are niche, like niche books. So I grew up confident. You couldn't tell me anything. Even if I was in a science lab with white people, I was like,
Keep going there. It's really gentle, so I don't know if it even makes a difference. Keep going.
But it was like, you can't tell me anything. I know about Black doctors. I know about Black scientists.
Right.
So even if I don't see them in my classroom, we out there. So yeah, I don't want it to be so hard for future Black and brown folks. And I don't know. That's why I wanted to write this book. And that's why, like you said, representation is so important, and belonging, because it instills a sense of confidence that you can't tell me anything. And like, I want people to have that confidence so they know, hey, even if it's not in your little community, there's a whole world of people of color who love the earth, and you go into this field with confidence to know that you belong here.
Yeah. I think that's so important. This conversation is their conversation. It's our conversation. It belongs to us. Like, this is not just a conversation that we are now becoming aware of, but this, like, when it directly, like you say, impacts you, it belongs to you. And so you need to be having the conversation. And now it's time for our climate confessions. Let's fess up to the bad habits we just can't kick.
I mean, I do use single-use plastic. Sometimes I recycle it when I can, but I think especially during the pandemic, I was just getting like, and I was also writing a book and I didn't leave the house. It was unhealthy. But I was getting so much takeaway or, like just food delivery all the time. And then another thing is I love sparkling water or mineral water. So I would just get so many cans when I could have just gotten a soda stream. So I just would have cans and cans and cans of LaCroix.
Yeah, the soda stream is the investment, right? You've got you have to think in the future and do the one big purchase. I don't like sparkling water though, so that is disgusting.
Oh my god, it's so good.
No judgment, but that is disgusting.
Horrible.
It has been a pleasure. I cannot wait. It has been a pleasure. I cannot wait to read your book. Thank you for taking the time to come chat with us.
Yeah.
Just so much. I'm tired, but honestly, my brain is just buzzing with ideas. Sometimes when I can't formulate questions, it's because I'm so like...
Yeah, you're really, really
I'm
there.
really into it. So It's not really helpful for hosting a podcast, but there you go.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
and remember, stay curious. Thank you for joining us this week. We really hope you enjoyed this episode.
If you did, please hit the follow button to make sure you get next week's release.
We are now officially crowdsourcing Climate Confession, so please leave yours in the ratings and the reviews section, and we'll shout out for you next time. And shout out to our fabulous team behind the pod.
This episode was produced by Josie Colter.
Comms written by Tess Lowry.
Artwork designed by Rebecca Mingus.
Curation by Maryam Pasha.
Mixed and engineered by Ben Beheshty.
Music also by Ben Beheshty.
Presented by Ben Hurst
And Maryam Pasha. Remember, stay curious.